The Women's Prize shortlist announcement is just days away, and so I thought I'd share my reviews of the books I've read so far and have a crack at guessing what the shortlist will look like. Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel. Before we get into the Women's Prize books, a small bit of what I think is quite exciting channel admin. I recently hit 4,000 subscribers here on YouTube and 1,000 followers on Instagram, which is frankly quite delightful. So first off, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your support. To celebrate, and specifically to celebrate the Instagram milestone, I've teamed up with the Indigo Press to give away 3 fantastic books written by women, all of which I read and loved in 2023. So I'm giving away Rianne Bell by Priya Hine, the Booker shortlisted Pearl by Sian Hughes, and the fantastic Between Dog and Wolf by Christina Gorcheva-Newbury. To enter, head over to my Instagram page and you could win one of these 3 novels, which will also come beautifully gift wrapped, thanks to the team over at Indigo. You've got until Sunday the 28th of April to enter. Anyway, back to business, and the Women's Prize shortlist is going to be announced in just a few days' time. And while I haven't made a concerted effort to try and read the entire long list, I have ended up reading just over half of it. I feel like someone who has signed up for a 5k and I've ended up doing a half marathon, but I have enjoyed the experience of doing that. I guess it's whatever the equivalent of like a runner's high is for bookish people. Does that make any sense? In today's video, I'm going to review all of the long listed books that I have read, which I'll go through in order from my least favourite to my most favourite, which has been quite hard to put into order, and even as I was writing my reviews up, the order did change quite a bit. So I think aside from the very bottom of the list and very top of the list, a lot of the ones in between could change on a different day. Once I've done all my reviews and my rankings, I will share my best guess at what I think the shortlist is going to look like. So let's get cracking. Sadly, my least favourite book that I've read from the long list is The Wren by Anne Enright. This is a book about 3 generations of an Irish family. A very small portion of the book is from the perspective of a famous but fictional male Irish poet called Phil McDarragh, and the remainder is kind of evenly split between his daughter Carmel and his granddaughter Nell. We actually start with Nell, who is a little bit adrift in life, ghostwriting blog posts and yearning to travel, to get away from her hometown and her cloying mother and just do something more with her life. Enright does a pretty good job, I think, of capturing that messy millennial voice, and I found Nell quite funny, though not particularly original. We then jump to her mother, Carmel, to get some more context, both in terms of her relationship with Nell and its problems, but also this looming figure of her father, Phil, which I'm pretty convinced must be short for philanderer. Her memories of her childhood were perhaps the most interesting part of the book for me, bringing to mind Imelda's section from The Bee Sting. I listened to the audiobook, and this part was narrated by Anne Enright herself, which I really loved. I thought she did a fantastic job, and Carmel was a much more compelling voice for me than Nell was. In between their chapters, we get snippets from Phil's poetry, which makes him feel much more present than he actually is in the prose, given there's only like 1, maybe 2 short chapters from his point of view. And I suspect that was done very purposefully to show that even though Phil is absent for much of the book, he does loom large over it. The novel isn't told in a completely linear fashion, but even within chapters, I found the passage of time just to be a really slippery thing in this novel. I struggled to make the shape of the narrative in my head. Things moved slow and then fast, dynamics and boundaries shifted before I'd fully grasped them. But it is just really beautifully written, I do have to say that. I can plot some of these books from the long list on a bit of a continuum, where at one end we've got excellent plot but with not very good writing, and at the other we've got this beautiful prose with nothing really happening. The Wren falls on that latter part of the scale. It is unquestionably beautifully written. I cannot fault its writing, but I just was not very moved by it at all. I struggled to care because I just didn't find much to chew on in the plot. There's definitely something interesting here, some really engaging themes about how problematic behaviour begets trauma, which begets problematic behaviour, but beyond that I didn't see much of a point to the novel. And that theme, I think, is tackled much better and threaded into a plot much more deftly by another book on the list. Overall, it just didn't really do it for me, and I found myself appreciating it a lot more than I found myself enjoying it. So The Wren was my 9th placing book, and in 8th place is And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. This is the story of Alice, a native Canadian woman. At the start of the novel is a prologue that recounts an episode from her teenage years when babysitting her cousin on her reservation and waiting for a boy she's invited over. She has this weird and supernatural experience that she feels changes the course of her life. Then in the book proper, we jump forward a number of years to when she's married a white white man with whom she's just had a baby, and she lives with him in a predominantly white suburb in Toronto. She's trying to deal with the pressures of becoming a mother, but also with the pressure she's put on herself to write a new version of the Haudenosaunee creation story. And it's under the weight of these stresses that Alice's world becomes more and more strange, and both she and us readers are left grappling with whether what she's experiencing is postpartum psychosis, or if there's something real and evil bubbling up into her world. For me, the book falls at the complete opposite end of that plot prose continuum to the Wren. It has a great plot that builds and builds and builds to this massive crescendo at the end, and I found that really engaging. It moves along at a terrific pace, builds tension brilliantly, and some of the horror and supernatural aspects were inventive and evocative and really effective, but don't worry, I'm not going to spoil if those were real or imagined. However, and I say this with a heavy heart, I just didn't really get on with the writing. It felt quite clumsy to me. It was written with this irreverent tone that Alice refers to herself. It led to this weird tonal clash that made me feel the wrong things at the wrong times. Another problem that I had with the novel was how it kind of sabotaged itself when dealing with racism. It undermined its own points. There were some really fantastic, eye-opening dynamics at play here. Her husband was taking classes to learn how to speak Mohawk, which seems really supportive, and he does it with a very supportive, enthusiastic fervour. But it makes Alice really uncomfortable because she doesn't speak Mohawk herself, and she's worried that in the afterlife he'll be able to speak to her ancestors, but she won't. He also tells her how he loves what she's doing with her writing, as it defeats this image of the sage old man telling the creation story, not appreciating that in her culture that's not the image, it's just his outsider white perspective, a stereotype that white people put onto native people. There's also a great but very stressful scene when Alice is locked out of her house and her neighbour thinks that she's trying to break in. And I found that all really powerful and nuanced. However, so much of this book revolves around paranoia, about questioning what's real and what's not. And while I get that this could be a device that reflects how white people treat people of colour when they speak up about racism, I just don't think it really helped the novel's message for us as readers to be wondering whether what she's seeing and hearing is actually happening. It made me weirdly feel like I was questioning the racism she was experiencing. Look, maybe that's intentional, but I think it undermined Alice's experience. Overall, I think this novel had loads of promise. I was really excited to read it, but it didn't quite line up with my specific taste. In 7th place is Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. I've already reviewed this one as part of my BookTube prize video, so I won't review it again in full here, but I'll link to that video in the description. This is about a British Palestinian woman called Sonia who, when visiting her sister in Israel, ends up taking part in a production of Hamlet in the West Bank. I liked but didn't love this novel. It gave me more to think about than any of the other books on the list, and I loved how it grappled with the competing ideas of art as resistance versus art as self-supplication. It also did a great job in articulating the many varied experiences of the Palestinian people, but the pacing for me was really painfully slow, and I found Sonia quite self-absorbed, and I kind of wish this had been told instead from multiple perspectives rather than just from hers. Lots of people have really loved this one though, so I'm definitely in the minority in placing it so low in my rankings. Okay, next is In Defense of the Act by Effie Black. This is about a woman called Jessica who is an evolutionary psychobiologist, and she studies suicide in animals. Suicide is the act of the title, and the reason she's ended up in this field is in a way to justify how suicide might be an evolutionarily beneficial part of life, a naturally emerging phenomena that can help a species survive as a whole. She has her reasons for this, and I won't dive into those too much because although it's introduced quite early on, I think it's an important plot thread that should be experienced within the context of the novel. It's a short book with, I think, a really good structure. In the first half, we work through Jessica's experiences with suicide and how it's affected and touched her life. And in the second half, there's a big change that makes her reevaluate some of the life choices she's made so far. Interspersed throughout are these short snippets of a point later in the timeline called a black day, where something obviously very bad and sad has happened, but we don't know what it is just yet. Those snippets of a black day really keep the tension high and the momentum up while she fills in her backstory. If this all sounds dreary, then you may be pleasantly surprised to know that this novel is, for the most part, pretty upbeat. It's often funny and it has this irreverence, not hugely dissimilar from And Then She Fell, but it's dialed back quite a bit more than that book, which worked really well for me. It's also very aware of how suicide and suicidal thoughts can be used for better or worse in a novel, notably in a scene where Jessica attends a book club that's read A Little Life, and while most people in the room loved it, a dissenting opinion in the room offers Effie Black the chance to hash out that debate. I guess the main thing that worked for me here was the closeness we have to the protagonist. It felt like a friend was telling me a story. I understood her perspective, I grieved with her when she grieved, I willed things to work out for her. And despite the amount of sadness and grieving, I came away from the novel hopeful, which, look, in a book all about suicide, is a really tall ask. There were a few negatives. Firstly, the font. I really could not handle the font. Print books should have serif fonts, and when I was reading this with its sans serif joviality, I felt like I was reading someone's emails. The font for the chapter titles was quite cool though, I'll give it that. On a more substantive note, I do think the writing wasn't quite at the same level as some of the other books on the list. The tongue-in-cheek tone did feel a little bit laboured at times, and there were a few outright bad sentences that I picked up on. There was one where Jessica was talking to a colleague at work, and she said something like, "I can't believe Gav, that bloody useless boss of ours, he was there." And I was just like, that's not how people talk. That should have been picked up in editing, really. But it's a book that made me feel things, and it took me on a journey that I really enjoyed. So if you are up to the subject matter and you can cope with discussion about suicide, I would definitely recommend giving this a go. Next for me then is Hangman by Maya Binyam, which is frankly a very bizarre book, but I'm very glad it's on the list. This is about a man who has had a bag packed for him, a plane ticket bought for him, and after 26 years away is on his way back to his home country in Africa to visit his gravely ill brother. He arrives at the airport, completely bewildered, not knowing who he's supposed to meet, where he's supposed to go. Some people there are over familiar with him, oversharing their stories, while others seem to turn away from him. The whole book is written in this flat, deadpan first-person prose, and there's a lot of resonance between that stylistic choice and the main character's thought processes. He's very passive, he doesn't really seem to know much about his country or even his own preferences, and even when he's preoccupied or invested in something, like there's this news story back in America that he keeps seeing online or on TV, he doesn't really pick up on the details. Does he want tea or coffee? He doesn't really know. Does he want some yogurt? He's not sure. Does he want to pony up for his cousin's obviously dodgy investment scheme to build a house? Don't know. Maybe. Everything's just at an arm's length. There's something really central in all of this about food in the book that I haven't quite unravelled, but the protagonist is given lots of food by lots of different people. Much of it he throws away rather than eats when he's just out of sight of whoever's given it to him, and there's a funny scene involving a napkin and a bit of a food mishap. I don't think this writing style will work for everyone, but I found it compulsively readable and also pretty funny. Like, right at the start of the book, the man in the plane seat next to him dies, and because he's in the window seat, he gets stuck on the plane while everyone gets off, passengers shuffling out and looking solemn and saying sorry to him, despite him having no connection to his neighbour, no real thoughts or feelings about it. He's just like, oh, this is a thing that's happened. It's weird and ridiculous, and I found the image very funny. If you think that sounds funny too, then maybe you will get on with this book. And it did just have this weird way of worming into my mind, at some points making me wonder why this guy was so weird, but at other points making me wonder why society was so weird. Like, sure, let's question everything back to first principles. Why not? The book does have a bit of a 1-2 punch of twists that again won't work for everyone, but it mostly did for me. I find that a really effective twist is one that makes you reevaluate what you've already read and see it in a new light or uncover some new meaning in it. And this kind of does that, but it also made some parts of the novel just a little bit more obscure to me. Like, I didn't understand what was actually going on now that I know what I know. I'm being purposefully obscure myself there because I don't want to ruin anything, but it is a really interesting way to see the story unfold. If you're on the fence about this one, I would suggest reading a couple of pages from like the Kindle sample or picking it up in a bookshop, and you will quickly know whether you like it or not. The way that the first few pages go is the way that the whole of the book goes. But yeah, for me, I really got a lot out of this book and really liked it. Next up for me is the most recent book that I've read from the long list, and that's Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. I have to admit right up front, I hated Megan Nolan's first book. I found it and its characters absolutely insufferable, and so I came to this, her sophomore novel, with some trepidation. I had been told it was very different, but I was worried that some of the character work would be just as painful for me and I would not get on with it. But as it turns out, I didn't need to have worried, because this is a fantastically, astutely observed character study of a family. And this is a family in crisis. The youngest member of the family, a child called Lucy, is implicated in the tragic death of another younger girl. It's important to note that that this family are already seen as outsiders, because the story is set in London, but they had moved there from Ireland a decade earlier. And there's a lot of latent discrimination and anti-Irish sentiment. And so when this happens, it's really easy for people to say, well, of course this went wrong. They're a rough family. They're bad people. Lucy's mother, Carmel, yes, another Carmel, her uncle Richie and her grandfather John are all whisked away to a hotel by a tabloid journalist named Tom. It's sold to them as being a way to escape the ruckus, to keep them safe in case their neighbours turn on them. But Tom has other ambitions, and he wants to break a sensationalised story about the death and the family of the girl responsible. He wants to paint them as having some core evil, as this always being an inevitability. And this is very much a book that addresses the way the media handles the tragedy, the ruthlessness with which the glory of the story is elevated above empathy. And I think the synopsis makes this sound like it could be a true crime story. At least that's how I felt about it before I dived in. But as pointed out in some of the comments on my last Women's Prize video, it's really not. There is very little mystery, little doubt about what actually happened beyond the details of exactly how. And instead, this is just a very intimate portrait of a family. It's about why they moved and their own personal demons, their dysfunctions, their dashed dreams, and their small brief victories and large cavernous losses. A huge success of this novel is its ability to make ridiculous character choices seem believable and understandable. Like, authors often have to get a character from A to B, and it can be hard to make their actions seem logical and not just there to drive the plot. Like, if you've read something and you're like, why the hell is this character choosing to do this? That's where an author is just moving the plot along and they haven't figured out how to realistically get the character from where they are to where they need to be. But here in this book, I believed in every single moment. I had my hand over my mouth, willing characters not to do what I could see they were about to do, to wake up and shake off their demons. And it made these bad decisions seem logical and inevitable. That takes real skill. I think this is a terrific book, and it's such a step up from my first experience of Nolan's writing. Over the course of the novel, we learn the stories of Carmel, Richie and John, and each of them is just so well portrayed, so nuanced and believable. These feel like real people's experiences, so beautifully and tragically observed. I felt gripped by each of the stories, despite none of them being particularly wild. They are just ordinary people with ordinary miseries. I have resisted using the book's title there. But what they do is paint this full, rich picture of a family, not to diagnose some familial rot that caused the tragedy, but to give it context, to explain how they got to where they are and why people see them like they do. It's very good, and I would highly recommend it. Okay, we're getting near the top now, and the next book, which is kind of a surprise for me, is Restless Dolly Maunder by Kate Grenville. This novel is about a woman called Dolly Maunder, born in the early 1900s in Australia, at a time when secondary education was not really a thing. Education in general was not compulsory for many children. Women could not own property. Married women had to give up their jobs to run their husband's household. It's, if nothing else, a good reminder of how far we've come. And something interesting to note, which I'm sure I had heard, but somehow completely blocked out of my memory until the end of the book, is that this is an imagining of Kate Grenville's actual grandmother's life, based on her mother's recollections and also her own research. It's an almost but not quite cradle-to-grave story that charts Dolly's life escaping from the clutches of her suffocating father, who tells Dolly from a young age that she will not, under any circumstances, become a woman that works, that this will only happen over his dead body. But Dolly is nothing if not driven. She is a woman out of time, unwilling to accept her lot, putting her smarts and her ambition to good use. She quickly realises that marrying for love will not come easy, and it will not satisfy her, so she marries pragmatically to someone she can partner with in business and starts running a boarding house. But she's always looking for the next thing, how to grow the business or how to try something new, so she carts her family around the country chasing the next thing and then the next. This restlessness, of course, has an impact on her personal relationships. She does things that may seem selfish, uprooting her family time and time again. Her marriage is not completely loveless, but more like a business partnership, but nevertheless responds with fury against another woman when her husband strays. She struggles to connect with her children. She has dark thoughts about them and pushes them down paths that she wishes had been open to her, but which her children might not want to pursue for themselves. I've seen a bit of criticism that Dolly is an unlikable character, that she's bullish and bullying. And while I sympathise with that point of view, I couldn't help but be in awe of her. Her determination was really quite something. She's not perfect, and she's not presented as a bastion of feminism. She's aware of who she is, and she lives with the trade-offs of pursuing her ambitions. She lives with her regrets. She can't help who she is and her compulsion to rebel against the patriarchal world she lives in. I just found her very, very impressive and very real. To be honest, this probably isn't as well written a book as Ordinary Human Failings, but it really moved me. If we come back to that continuum of great plot but not great writing, which And Then She Fell sits on one end of the scale for me, and no plot but beautiful writing, which the Wren is at the other end, then I think The Restless Dolly Maunder sits somewhere in the middle, and that really worked for me. It felt like a sweet spot. And because I was so drawn in by it, I found myself tearing up towards the end because I felt so attached to Dolly and her reflections on her life and her choices. I'm surprised this has got such a frosty reception on BookTube and Instagram because I thought it was pretty terrific. So we're left with the top two being the books I'd already read before the longlist was announced, and I don't know if that is some sort of accidental bias, but I'm just going to roll with it. In second place, we've got Western Lane by Chetna Maru, which was shortlisted for the Booker last year. I've reviewed this one already and I'll link to my review in the description, but this is about a young girl called Gopi and her sisters dealing with the aftermath of the death of their mother. Their father channels his and their grief into playing squash, and Gopi shows some promise, so the book follows her experience of training and eventually competing in a tournament. I thought this was a really brilliant, touching, gentle book that has a lot in common with Claire Keegan's work, and there's so much beauty and tenderness both on the page and also in what's not said. It's a book that's really stayed with me much more than I expected when I first read it, and so that's why it's so high up on these rankings. In first place then, it may come as no surprise to know that my number one book from the ones I've read is Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. It was one of my favourite reads of last year and I was just delighted to see it on the long list. Again, it's another one I've reviewed already, so I'll link to my review in the description, but to summarise it, it's a story told from the perspective of a mother, soldier, addressed to her young son, sailor. It recounts the difficult early days of motherhood and is just this completely absorbing, beautiful, difficult story of the love and the fear and the frustration of that time. All these competing emotions and the loss of self, the sacrifices made for someone you love unconditionally, but who doesn't understand that love or those sacrifices. I've read nothing else like it and I just absolutely adored it. So those are my rankings of the 9 books that I've already read. I think overall I've definitely warmed up to this long list after how much of a surprise it was, and I certainly was interested enough to pick up 7 more books in addition to the 2 I'd already read. I don't think it's been a total knockout for me. I've only given one of these books 5 stars. There are certainly better eligible books that I've read. But look, prize lists are what they are, and they aren't always going to align perfectly with my taste. At the very least, I think it's a super interesting and diverse set of stories in terms of the perspectives and the themes and the geographies, and I'm glad these books have been put under the spotlight. But when the lights dim on 10 of the titles, which do I think will be left illuminated as the shortlist? Seeing as I've not read all of the books, I'm not going to just say that my 6 favourites so far are what I think are going to be the shortlist, because that would be, quite frankly, stupid. Instead, I'm going to make a bit of a hybrid prediction and wish list, including some that I think will appeal to the judges, some that I've loved, and also some that I just really want to have a good excuse to read. My first pick is, of course, Soldier Sailor, which I will be furious if I do not see this on the shortlist. Well, not furious, but a very sad little sailor. Then I think we'll see Enter Ghost. Most people seem to have adored this book in a way that I didn't quite manage to, and I think its timeliness and the importance of Palestinian voices makes it a really strong contender for the shortlist, but also for the win. Then I'm picking Brotherless Night, partly because I just really want to read it, and partly because it's had an exceptional response from readers. I think it has like the highest Goodreads rating of all of the books on the long list. I didn't prioritise it at this stage, mainly because I fully expect it to be on the shortlist, and so I'm very excited to dive into it. Next, I'm going to say 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster, if for no other reason than it's blurbed by Monica Ali. The Booker book blurbed by the head judge last year, this other Eden made the shortlist, so that's evidence enough for me. Although I didn't love it, I think The Wren is a strong contender just because of Anne Enright's pedigree, and so I'm going to include her in my predicted shortlist. The final slot is a tough one, and I think there could be an argument made for many of the remaining books. Part of me wants to say Hangman because I think of the books I've read, that one is probably the one that's going to have more of an impact on a second reading, which the judges will have had to do for all of the long-listed books. But my guess is going to be Nightbloom, just as a wild card, and partly because I have a copy and I'd like an excuse to read it. So those are my Women's Prize reviews and my predicted shortlist. I'd love to hear from you in the comments if you've read any of these and if you agreed with me or not on how I felt about these books, as well as what you think is going to make an appearance on the shortlist on Wednesday. Do let me know. Do give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and if you would like to see more content from me, then hit subscribe and you'll get a new video about once a week. But until next time, toodles!